Hi, I'm doing a series on St. Augustine's Confessions, and I did two videos on different parts of his wonderful book. Today, I want to focus on book 3 of Confessions. And in book 3, he starts with a fascinating line where he says, I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love. What does he mean by that? I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love. What he's talking about is two different types of loves. One is the mature love, which is a love that has an object and you're in love with that object. The other is a form of an immature love where you're not in love with a deserving object or a person. Rather, you're in love with just your own feeling of love. So that's the two types of love he's talking about. I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love. And this is something you might see sometimes in different personalities. Have you ever come across someone who may not quite love another person fully, but what they may be in love with is their own feeling of feeling loved. And when somebody's in that space, they may be able to fall in love with one person one day and then switch to another and then switch to another and switch to another, because their love does not have an object or another person in mind. Their love is about feeling this feeling of love. Anyway, so he starts with this fascinating line, and then he diagnoses himself of why was he that way. You see, when Augustine wrote Confessions, he wrote it much later in his life, looking back on his early life when he was not a Christian. So this is the time he's looking back and he's diagnosing himself of why was I like that, where I didn't have an object of love, I was just in love with the feeling of love. And he goes on to say, for within I was hungry, all for the want of spiritual food, which is thyself, my God. And again, Augustine writes the Confessions as a prayer to God. He's talking to God about his own life and how he came to fall in love with God, right? For within I was hungry for all that want of that spiritual food, which is thyself, my God, yet I did not hunger for it. I had no desire whatever for this incorruptible food, not because I had it in abundance, but because the emptier I was, the more I hated the thought of the spiritual food. What's he saying here? He's saying God is the spiritual food. He knew he wanted that spiritual food, but he couldn't get himself to actually want to eat that. And he says the emptier I was, the more I hated it. So what's causing this for him? He goes on to say, because of all this, my soul was sick. Because he knows he needs the spiritual food, but he's not eating the spiritual food because he hates it. Because of all this, my soul was sick and lunged out instead in mad desire to scratch myself with the rub of carnal things. No. Yet, if there was no soul in them, they would not be object of love, right? So he's talking about his soul being sick because he doesn't have the spiritual food. And as a solution to that, he says his soul lunged out to scratch himself with carnal things. And these carnal things are not worthy objects of love. What's going on here? Again, Augustine is talking about a deep form of psychology. So I'm going to digress a little bit into psychology to explain what he's talking about here. This lunging out. When you're sick inside, in your soul, why do you lunge out? There is a book called Indistractable. In that he says, when we have negative emotions in us, we are often tempted to distract ourselves from our negative emotions, fear, sadness, anger, by looking at the phone. And he says it is a desire to not want to pay attention to ourselves is what makes us lunge outward. And in some ways, that's what Augustine is talking about. He's saying, my soul was sick, I knew it, but I lunged outward to rub my wounds in carnal things. The phone is a good example, and the carnal thing could be anything for anyone. Because when we do that, when we look at our phone, it increases the dopamine in our brain. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of motivation. There is a wonderful book called Dopamine Nation, written by a psychiatrist called Anne Lembeke. She says, anytime we do an activity that increases our dopamine, it creates a dopamine increase in the brain because that's a rewarding event. You feel upset or angry, you look at the phone, it makes you feel better, right? Because the dopamine in the brain goes up, and that's the reward in the brain. And she says the more and more we do this activity, it reshapes the neural pathways in our brain. So the next time we feel angry or sad, we are tempted to do what? Again, look at the phone. So that creates new neural pathways. The more and more we do it, she says, we get to addiction. Addiction is where we've been doing this dopamine hit over and over and over again, and at some point, the baseline for dopamine goes up, which means once you have the rewarding event, it creates a huge crash. Have you ever had this experience where you ate a lot of ice cream? It felt great when you ate the ice cream, but after that you feel this deep crash. So that's that dopamine cycle. And she says when somebody does this over and over again, it results in an interesting paradox. She says the paradox is that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, and that's that carnal things that St. Augustine is talking about, right? She says leads to anhedonia, which is the inability to enjoy pleasure of any kind. Hedonia is hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. She says the more and more we overuse this dopamine cycle, we lose the ability to take joy in things that we took joy in. In some ways, that's what Augustine is getting at when he says, the emptier I was, the more I hated the part of the spiritual food. He loses his ability to enjoy good things. Interestingly, when Woody Allen did the movie Annie Hall, the original title that he had for the movie was Anhedonia. It is the inability to feel pleasure. And when you watch the movie, you see why he originally thought of that idea and then eventually switched it to Annie Hall. Because in that movie, you see a very clear sense of this thing that Augustine talks about, where Woody Allen is not yet in love, but he is in love with love. He doesn't fully love the Diane Keaton character because he doesn't have the mature love of being in love with an object. But what he loves is just this feeling of being in love. And this feeling of being in love just becomes a form of chasing after feelings without having an object or a person to be in love with. Which is where I think Augustine's insight, which even though he didn't know all the psychology, he was a deeply introspective man, which makes his insights relevant even today, even for people like Woody Allen. So what is love? Love is falling in love with an object, with a person that you want to act for the sake of that person. And in that sense, incarnation, God sending his own son to us, is the greatest act of love. Because we are the object of his love, he sends his own son to us, which is this time of Christmas, of celebrating that great act of love from God. In fact, Augustine goes on to say, you had pity on me when I had not yet confessed, in that I sought you not according to the understanding of the mind by which you have set us above the beasts, but according to the sense of the flesh. So again, he's talking about staying away from God and following the flesh and the carnal things. And then he has this important line which talks about incarnation. Yet, all this time you were most inward than my inmost part, the inmost place in my heart, and loftier than the highest. So he says, even though I was running after other things, you had pity on me, and you were deep inside of me. I was trying to leave myself and go out to search for all these carnal things, but you are waiting for me on the inside. Which again is the theme of incarnation. God sending his own son to us to be the face of his love, and then God sending the Holy Spirit to remind us of how much he loves us by looking within. But if we keep lunging out, looking at our phone and different things, those carnal things to scratch our wounds, so to speak, it is hard for us to look within to see where God is. So the big theme that carries all of the Confessions is the most famous line that comes in the first chapter, which I talked about last time. For thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. So God is our spiritual food. Until we have that spiritual food, we will always be restless. And that's what we see in the movie Annie Hall with Woody Allen. Even though they both could be a good couple, they are in a space of restlessness because Woody Allen's character is not matured to the place of falling in love with the object of love. And so he stays in the space of just this feeling of being in love, which is where St. Augustine's insights are deeply psychological, deeply helpful for us to understand what does it mean to be in love, ultimately leading us to this deep truth of knowing God, you have made us for thyself, and God is our spiritual food, and our hearts are restless till we find our rest in thee. And when we rest in God, then we can enjoy all these other things that are there. And then talk about, because Augustine talks about that too. He doesn't say you have to shun everything, boycott everything, leave the world and go in. He says, no, you have to enjoy the world. And that's a theme that he'll pick up on and talk more about, which I'll talk more about in some of the subsequent videos. So until I see you in the next video, bye for now. And if you're able to subscribe here to the channel so that you wouldn't miss this next video. Merry Christmas. Bye.